In the MAGA world, there was and is one word, above all, that was and is the core message to his core followers, the word that forms their identity. That word is winning.
It will change. We will have so much winning if I get elected that you may get bored with winning. Believe me, I agree. You'll never get bored with winning. We never get bored.
We must start totally winning and winning and winning again. Remember when I used to say, we're going to win so much? We're going to win that the people of Missouri are going to go to your governor and they're going to say, Governor, please go see the president. We can't stand winning so much. Remember, I used to say that, right?
So if a core value, a core belief of a movement is through me and with me we are all winners, then the greatest threat to such a movement would be losing. Losing just can't happen. It is not conceivable. To call winning into question created a level of cognitive dissonance that was intolerable. It needed to be resolved. The president provided his followers and himself a solution to this problem. He asserted that the election was not lost, it was stolen.
Trump is still your president!
It's legal for them to count votes in Pennsylvania 2 days after the election on November 3rd?
Yes.
You're wrong. Go. I don't even want to talk to you.
I believe that Donald Trump won the election. I believe that they tried to steal the election.
The ballots that you said you saw are lying around the place or in trash cans or whatever, where are you hearing that from?
I mean, the videos are going viral everywhere. I've seen them on TikTok. I've seen them on Facebook. I've seen them on Fox News. I've seen them on the local news around my area.
I've seen too much pieces of different evidence so far that shows that at this point I would be okay with a revote.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. When you have video footage of people taking bags of ballots and showing that they are for Donald Trump and lighting them on fire.
You are not going to steal this election from me.
When we went to bed on election night, when they told us they stopped counting, we woke up and there was a vertical spike right for Biden, 130,000 votes approximately. That's when I knew there was a problem.
Now, as my buddy Steve Bannon says, if you're going to lie, be believable about it. Because you do not have 138,000 votes come in and 135,000 of them come in for Biden.
This graphic, which has added 2 stages to Kubler-Ross's original 5-stage model, illustrates how we process grief, though we now know the process is not linear. People take a step forward, a step back, go forward again, and back again. But eventually, for most people, most of the time, they do get to acceptance. Shock is normal. Denial is the brain's way of making sure that one doesn't get too high a dose of grief too soon. Anger, bargaining, and all the other delaying tactics we use to soften the blow are understandable and normal too. It's the being stuck, and stuck for a long time in these early stages of grief, that are a problem. Research subsequent to Ross's initial publication of her research has demonstrated that loss is loss, whether we've lost a loved one to death or divorce, or we've lost a family heirloom of significance, or an election to which we have a strong emotional connection. The stages of grief are the same. Clinton supporters reacted to her loss with shock and with sadness. Trump supporters in 2020 reacted with denial and anger, which Trump and his professional class of enablers have relentlessly ginned up and reinforced on a daily basis. This grooming process started back in the 2016 campaign and continued into the 2020 campaign and its aftermath. For true believers, their grief at losing the 2020 election is real and unprocessed. They are frozen in time, unable to go through the natural process of grieving. The theory of cognitive dissonance is central to understanding how most Republicans in the year 2022 believed the 2020 election was stolen. The theory of cognitive dissonance explains how most progressives and liberals in the 1930s believed that Joseph Stalin was a good guy, doing what was necessary to protect the interests of the working people in Russia. And that did require murdering or exiling 2 to 3 million Russian citizens. And then there's the current era, when the majority of Russian citizens viewed the invasion of Ukraine through their esteemed leader's eyes as a justifiable defense of Mother Russia, the homeland. President Putin had said to them, "We had no other choice except to take military action against Ukraine. We are helping and saving people. We are simply taking measures to ensure the security of Russia itself." The Ukrainians were deliberately fostering those neo-Nazi grassroots, and their clash with the Russian forces was inevitable. Most importantly, the theory of cognitive dissonance explains how you and I, everyone who is human, every day, in matters small and large, bend our views of reality to line up with our most cherished beliefs. To help us understand how this theory was derived from experimentation, and to wrap our heads around the very important nuances of this theory, let's take a look at one of Leon Festinger's first experiments.
Each subject's assignment to turn each of the wooden pegs a quarter turn to the right, then to start over and turn them again and again and again until the experimenter tells him to stop. It is the most boring and fatiguing task we could devise. Our purpose was to provide each subject with the same dull job so each would have a similar negative experience. In order to obtain the scientific data we need, we use a little subterfuge and say we're studying motor performance. Afterward, they will be told the truth.
Okay, that's fine. Let me tell you now what we're actually studying here. It's the effect of preparatory mental set on performance. Half of the subjects are doing the job cold, just as you did. The rest of the subjects are prepared by being told that the experiment will be very interesting and enjoyable. In fact, lots of fun. Now I have a somewhat unusual request to make of you. The next subject is waiting right outside, but the fellow who ordinarily gives the spiel isn't here. I wonder if you could possibly take his place. As a matter of fact, we figure we'll be needing someone in the future, so I'd like to offer you a $20 retainer and have you remain on call for us. Would that be all right?
$20? That'd be fine.
We'd like to give you $1 as a sort of a retainer and have you remain on call with us. Would that be all right with you?
Yes, that'll be all right.
We divide the group. Half will get $20 to tell someone the dull task is interesting. The other half get $1 for the same job. They all agree to tell an obvious lie.
Okay, thank you very much. The next subject is waiting right outside.
In reality, the subject meets one of our assistants, trained to get them to publicly commit themselves to this untruth.
They gave us some pegs to turn, and turned them for a while, and it was a lot of fun. It was sort of interesting, I guess.
Really? Well, that's strange, because a friend of mine took the experiment last week. I think it was the same experiment, and he said it was pretty miserable, and that I should do everything I could to get out of it.
Well, I think maybe your friend was wrong. Perhaps it was a different experiment, because this was a lot of fun. It appeared to me as if it were a puzzle. We had to turn these knobs, and I tried to figure out what we were doing it for, but I really couldn't figure it out. Perhaps you'll have better luck.
Well, what do you have to do exactly? Well, we turned pegs and knobs the same way each time, and that's about what it was, but it was very interesting. Do you try to find a solution of any kind?
The $1 subject sells just as hard as the $20 one. But which of them will come to believe what they are saying? Other theories might predict that the man who is paid most would have the highest motivation for enthusing over the dull task and would be most sold on it himself. Cognitive dissonance theory leads to an exactly opposite prediction. The man who is paid $20 knows that the task is dull, but he also knows that he had sufficient justification for saying that it wasn't. How much did you learn from this experiment?
Learn? Well, I don't think I learned too much from the experiment.
Did you enjoy working on the manual test?
Well, it really wasn't too enjoyable. In fact, it was rather boring.
How about the man who is paid $1? He knows the task is dull, but he has two discrepant thoughts. He also knows that he did not have sufficient justification for saying that it wasn't. For him, there is dissonance. Time after time, we have seen what follows. He reduces the dissonance by changing his opinion about the dullness of the task. Philly, how much did you learn from this experiment?
Well, at first I don't think I was learning it too much, but when I got into it, I think it was quite interesting, and after a while it got better.
Did you enjoy working on the manual test?
Yes, I enjoyed it.
Would you like to participate in such an experiment again?
Yes, I think I would like to.
In this experiment performed in 1954, there are two groups of subjects. Both groups have the same initial experience. All subjects in each group are required to complete a boring task. The group that was only paid $1 came to believe the lie that they were selling, but not the people who were paid $20. Why? The $1 person had to do the extra cognitive work of explaining to himself why he could so easily lie. He or she had to explain away seeing themselves as liars. The thought, I am a liar, is not consistent with the self-image of, I'm a good person. So to resolve that dissonance, the person changes their perceptions of their experience from, this is a boring task, to, this is an interesting task. The $20 person, on the other hand, did not have any dissonance to resolve. Being able to say, I got paid $20, was enough of an explanation to keep their self-perception of being honest intact.
Oh, I'm sure, yes. I'm very thorough with the information I look at. I have my opinions, obviously, but I'm not just going to go around retweeting blatantly false information or things that I believe that are just, I look at things that are suspicious.
How do you go from almost losing 200,000 in 5 hours, you're down to 30,000 votes away from winning?
A lot of Democrats.
So what happens when a winner, a super winner, loses? You double down. You reduce the dissonance by imagining and repeating ever more wild and conspiratorial alternative facts and stories to explain how you actually won. You don't have to work hard to draw your followers into your dissonance-reducing ideas and activities because they have become just as invested in seeing themselves as winners as you have. You are MAGA, and MAGA is you, and MAGA does not lose. In addition to the theory of cognitive dissonance, there are a number of other important psychological phenomena that have been well researched and can help us to gain an understanding of why people sometimes come to believe lies told to them by charismatic leaders, Donald Trump being just one of many such leaders. The psychological phenomena of confirmation bias describes our underlying tendency to notice, focus on, and give greater credence to evidence that fits within our existing beliefs. This bias can lead us to make poor decisions because it distorts the reality from which we draw evidence. Under experimental conditions, decision makers have a tendency to actively seek information and assign greater value to evidence confirming their existing beliefs rather than entertaining new ones. This can be considered a form of bias in evidence collection. Conclusions we draw from biased evidence are more likely to be false than those we draw from objective evidence. This is because they are farther from reality. Research conducted on the subject of confirmation bias supports the hypothesis that there is an underlying tendency for us to notice, focus on, and give greater credence to evidence that fits within our existing beliefs. This theory has many similarities to cognitive dissonance theory. It's viewing the same phenomena but through a slightly different lens. In the context of belief in a stolen election, confirmation bias theory explains the cognitive processes by which the false evidence provided by the former president was examined by his followers and determined to be accurate. Lest, however, we think that confirmation bias is something that applies only to those people, not me, not us, let me ask you to reflect for a moment on a few questions. When you send someone a text or email and they do not reply, have you ever inferred this behavior to have meaning that is consistent with your view of that person, rather than a simpler explanation like, they were really busy, and that's why they didn't respond? Have you never made a judgment about a person based on how they dress or their accent? Right. We all do it, to a greater or lesser extent. It is work to keep bias out of our processing of information. It is very hard to be objective. It is very hard to be truly neutral. Of all the possible explanations for why millions and millions of people believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, this is the simplest explanation. And let's remember, in science, simpler explanations trump more complex explanations, unless there's something about the simple explanation that leaves some gap, some part of the phenomena you're studying unexplained. People who choose to get their political information exclusively or mostly from news sources who repeat the same information are likely to believe it. I'm going to quote for you now from a May 2021 article in the journal Cognitive Research Principles and Implications. The article is titled, The Effects of Repetition Frequency on the Illusory Truth Effect. Here goes. Repeated information is often perceived as more truthful than new information. People tend to perceive claims as truer if they've been exposed to them before. This is known as the illusory truth effect, and it helps explain why advertisements and propaganda work, and also why people believe fake news to be true. Further described in the journal Nature, the authors of the article, The Psychological Drivers of Misinformation Belief and Its Resistance to Correction, they state that the illusory truth effect arises because people use peripheral cues such as familiarity, which is a signal that a message has been encountered before, processing fluency, a signal that a message is either encoded or retrieved effortlessly, and cohesion, a signal that the elements of a message have references in memory that are internally consistent as signals for truth, and the strength of these cues increases with repetition. Thus, repetition increases belief in both misinformation and facts. Illusory truth can persist months after first exposure, regardless of cognitive ability and despite contradictory advice from an accurate source or accurate prior knowledge. There's nothing really surprising about these findings. There's considerable cognitive literature to support them. Whether it is state-run media in North Korea making use of repetition of false information, or Rupert Murdoch's owned media outlets in the UK or US, repetition is the #1 methodology used to reinforce information known to be demonstrably inaccurate. This graphic from the same article summarizes the other prime cognitive and socio-affective drivers that make the adoption of false beliefs more likely. Now let's talk for a moment about pattern recognition, which I see as the underlying cognitive phenomena that drives cognitive dissonance. Human beings are not the only intelligent organisms on planet Earth. Other creatures, great and small, process information gathered from their environment for the purpose of organizing and executing responses that increase their chances of survival and reproduction. Elephants, dolphins, and chimpanzees, and quite a few other higher life forms are exceptional at pattern recognition, but humans are the undisputed masters. But here's the rub. For every pattern we recognize correctly, there are many patterns we think we recognize correctly, but in fact, we are wrong. We are inaccurate. The pattern is perceived in the mind, but does not actually exist in the real world. That's fine, in fact great, if one's goal is to create a painting, but tragic when the pattern identified is safe to launch, when in fact there was ample evidence that it was not safe to launch. In short, for each pattern we think we see, there will be true positives and false positives. In addition, there will be patterns that we correctly assess to not exist. These are true negatives. Conversely, there are false negatives, which are inaccurate determinations that a pattern does not exist, when in fact it does. For example, this is not a hummingbird. True. This is not a hummingbird. False. So now let's consider pattern recognition in the context of the 2020 presidential election. A group of core Trump supporters who are heavily invested in the pattern, "We are winners, we only win," are confronted with data that overwhelmingly supports the conclusion, your group just lost the election. Cognitive dissonance theory predicts correctly that this group will be heavily motivated to reduce the dissonance that this dichotomy presents. As pattern-seeking organisms, they will look for patterns that accomplish this objective.
It's legal for them to count votes in Pennsylvania 2 days after the election on November 3rd?
Yes.
You're wrong. Go. I don't even want to talk to you.
I believe that Donald Trump won the election. I believe that they tried to steal the election.
Donald Trump, correctly interpreting the likely will of the electorate, prepositioned the idea, which is a complex pattern, that if they lost, it would be because the election was rigged.
Because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election.
The false positive that the election was rigged provided his followers with a much-needed pattern, one that could explain away feelings of humiliation that seeing the actual pattern represented. The false negative Trump provided, "We did not lose the election," explained away the dissonance his followers encountered whenever they saw ever-mounting evidence that Joe Biden had actually won the election. The psychological costs of losing face should not be underestimated. It is humiliating to admit you're wrong. Interventions which enable people to opt out without serious loss of face or humiliation can help in this respect. As reported by Cassidy Hutchinson at the January 6 hearings, this fear of humiliation is in large part what drove the president's actions.
So he had said something to the effect of, "I don't want people to know we lost, Mark. This is embarrassing. Figure it out. We need to figure it out. I don't want people to know that we lost."
Let's put a face on how awful it can be to lose face, what humiliation looks like when identity is merged with a political party that only wins, never loses.
I came here today to get an up-close and personal look at the 7 traitors to the United States Constitution.
Hey, again,
for
please.
Sitting at that desk.
This whole thing was a sham. You're violating the Constitution. You're violating our rights by saying you can only petition the government for 2 minutes. Where's your authority to do that? Who died made you king?
What we saw on Election Day was outrageous. And to say that it was anything but that is either you think we're stupid or you're just that arrogant.
Intimacy is a characteristic of a close personal relationship that is highly predictive of trust. And trust is predictive of how likely we are to evaluate the patterns described by another person to be accurate or not. We associate the term intimacy with physical intimacy, sex. But that is only one manifestation of intimacy. Intimacy in a relationship is a feeling of being close, as well as emotionally connected to and supported by another person, or in some cases, to a group of people. In an intimate relationship, we are able to share a whole range of thoughts, feelings, and experiences that we likely would not share with others. The sharing of such feelings with others who we do not feel close to would likely be perceived as socially inappropriate and might well indeed provoke social sanctions. This is what makes the sharing of highly personal feelings and thoughts so risky. Simply put, Donald Trump's core supporters love him. They really love him. And often, as we all know, most of us know, love is often blind. For those of you who have had the experience of falling in love, and I hope that is most of you, you know from your own personal experiences that when we are in this altered state of consciousness, our ability to accurately appraise the one we love is highly compromised. We see patterns that simply are not there. In her dissertation titled, "Is Love Really Blind?" Lisa Matthews says, research has confirmed the tendency for individuals to turn a blind eye to another's faults and imperfections in order to create a positive illusion of the significant other. She goes on to say, it has been found that when one is in love, while one area of the brain is activated, another area, which happens to be the area responsible for critical thought, it is suppressed. This finding explains the difficulty of making rational decisions when in love. Additionally, she points out, quote, love can prevent one from seeing the negative aspects of the one that they love, which can often be a risk to the individual in love that they fail to see the warning signs of unreciprocated affection. And I would add, when we do see such signs, they produce such cognitive dissonance that our brains work hard to cover them up, sometimes work really overtime. So it is not difficult to see how the impaired accuracy of our love-struck pattern recognition capabilities lead to poor outcomes, outcomes we would have ordinarily avoided if we had not been in love.
Show me your mystery, show me your shame, tell me your secret code. Forget every lesson that you ever learned about the middle of the road. Oh, and let's break the bank and the rules and the chains. Do everything that we ever dreamed of. Let's build a fire and let it get hot. Let's go down in the flames of love. Read the contract all the way through. Use your blood to sign your name. Take a look in the mirror. Remember this moment. You're never gonna feel quite the same. Oh, and I will show you my conscience, show you my shame, every hurt that I am made of. Let's build a fire and let it get hot. Let's go down in the flames of love.
Let's go down in the flames of love. I think that's what January 6th was about for many of the people who participated that day. I'm well aware that this analysis goes against the grain of virtually every political and psychological analysis of the events of January 6th I've read. And it isn't to say that these other ways of looking at January 6th are not true. You should read the report of the January 6th Commission. But in the realm of the personal, the realm of our innermost feelings, heads over heel love for the great leader explains a lot too. So let's move on and explore a number of additional hypotheses that might help us to understand how so many people could come to believe the stolen election fallacy. Hypothesis number 1. People who believe the stolen election fallacy demonstrate the trait of gullibility, which is defined as a tendency to be easily persuaded that something is real or true. The more gullible a person is, the more likely they are to be persuaded that something is true when it isn't. In other words, they are more likely to see false positives. As stated in a recent article titled, "You Are More Gullible Than You Think," Bob B. Hoffman, PhD, says, and I quote, "The practical impact of gullibility is immense. It may result in the distortion of personal reality and the tendency to make poor social, civic, and economic decisions, including overestimating the positive qualities of others, advocating for contrived and dubious causes, or falling for elaborate and financially untenable Ponzi schemes." End quote. Research has revealed several factors that are predictive of a person being more gullible than the general population. The first is an unconditional respect for authority and a tendency to conform. Saying no to others is a pushback, and most people don't like the perception of being classified as difficult. Second, people who are gullible tend to be overconfident in their knowledge. Those who believe they have expertise on a topic often make more errors than those who have requisite knowledge because they are overly confident in their decisions. People who are gullible also tend not to use analytical thinking. Instead, they rely on personal experience or intuition as the basis for making decisions. They may reject known information because the questionable message at hand appears to be more salient or easier to understand. Research shows that people who are gullible are more likely than the general population to lack self-control and make impulsive, emotionally charged decisions. Research conducted at the University of Leicester also shows that people who have suffered life's hard knocks while growing up tend to be more gullible than those who have been more sheltered. These are people who have come to distrust their own judgment. Such a person might believe something to be true, but when they, for example, read something in a newspaper that contradicts their opinion, or they talk to someone with a different point of view, that individual is more likely to take on the other person's point of view. Before moving on to my second hypothesis, I would note that there are indeed scientific studies that demonstrate that in general, propaganda, advertising, and other forms of persuasion are not effective, and that when people do buy into ill-founded ideas they're being sold, they generally are conforming to pre-existing beliefs. And that brings us to hypothesis number 2. People who believe the stolen election fallacy are conforming to the group norms of the MAGA community. In her article, Political Conformity, Evidence and Mechanisms, author Elizabeth Suhay describes conformity as a type of social influence representing the myriad ways in which people, in person, represented, or even imagined, have an impact on other people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. She goes on to cite research which describes conformity as a largely implicit psychological process, whereby individuals come to believe that group norms are appropriate, and for that reason they bring their beliefs, opinions, and/or behavior into line with them. She goes on to cite an extensive list of scientific studies that provide empirical evidence for the concept of conformity. Researchers Taylor Carlson and Jamie Settle postulate that the concept of conformity does not involve attitude change or persuasion. Rather, it involves self-censoring to match a socially desirable norm. They conducted 2 experiments to test this idea. Their experiments were not definitive for the field, but the results did demonstrate that individuals are uncomfortable around political interactions in which they hold an opinion counter to the group. In his book, Collective Illusions, Todd Rose looks at this phenomena from the 100,000-foot level. He asserts that conformity is hardwired into our DNA because there is an evolutionary advantage to conformity. It facilitates the group operating in concert towards collective goals. Studies of conformity in the context of cults have shown that when devotion to the leader and their mission evolves into devotion to the personality cult as a whole, followers may experience identity fusion, in which one's social identity and individual self-concept are fused. Let's move on to hypothesis number 3. People who believe the stolen election fallacy are members of a cult of personality. They are true believers. A cult of personality, sometimes referred to as a personality cult, is generally defined as, quote, exaggerated devotion to a charismatic, political, religious, or other leader, end quote. I will refer to members of such groups as true believers, a term that was used and popularized by Eric Hoffer in his 1951 book, The True Believer. The book describes the psychological roots of fanatical groups. It is a bit dated now, but the concept of true believer holds up well. A cult of personality arises when a leader is represented as larger than life through imagery and words of uncritical praise and flattery. Propaganda is a common vehicle used to help create personality cults. Leaders are often depicted as superhuman, courageous, wise, and incapable of error. If a leader is viewed as godlike, it is less likely followers will criticize or question their policies or challenge their power. Sociologist Max Weber introduced the concept of charismatic authority, which most personality cult researchers agree is essential to understanding this kind of leadership. According to Weber, charisma is a, quote, certain quality of an individual personality under which he is considered extraordinary and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or has exceptional powers or qualities, end quote. Authoritarian figures such as Benito Mussolini of Italy and Vladimir Putin of Russia are often associated with cults of personality, as are totalitarian regimes such as the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Germany under Adolf Hitler, and North Korea under Kim Jong-un. Examples of religious cult leaders include Jim Jones, David Berg, and Father Divine. There are also doctrinal cult leaders who have achieved great notoriety as a result of the horrific outcomes of their leadership. The poster boy for this is Charlie Manson.
When I stand on the mountain and I say, do it, it gets done. If it don't get done, then I'll move on it. And that's the last thing in the world you want me to do.
Of course, not all cults of personality turn violent or necessarily result in negative outcomes for their followers. Cynthia Vinnie, a writer and researcher in this area, observes that followers of charismatic leaders form an exalted, even superhuman version of their persona in the minds of their followers. The followers accept the leader's persona and authority, which leads to their devotion to the leader and their mission to bring about an imagined future. Dr. Vinnie goes on to say that a feature of charismatic authority is that it's frequently critical of existing institutions and seeks to bring about some form of change, which could constitute anything from a previously idealized time to revolutionary reform or change. The charismatic leader sells the message that I am disrupting the established order. There's a crisis in society that current institutions can't fix. Only I can fix these problems.
I alone can fix it.
Now, let's drill down further on the special relationship that true believers have with their charismatic leaders. Identity fusion is a psychological construct rooted in social psychology and cognitive anthropology. The term describes a form of alignment with groups in which members experience a visceral sense of oneness with the group. It explains the psychological mechanics of loyalty. The construct of identity fusion relies on making a distinction between the personal self and the social self. As the name suggests, identity fusion involves the union of the personal and social selves. When fusion occurs, the boundaries between the personal and the social become highly permeable. The theory of identity fusion proposes that fused persons come to regard other group members as family and develop strong relational ties to them as well as ties to the collective. Therefore, fused persons are not just bound to the collective, they are tied to the individual members of the collective. This describes the relationships among the core supporters of MAGA quite well. Freud also addressed the phenomena of individual identification with mass movements. In his monograph, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud relies heavily on the writings of sociologist and psychologist Gustave Le Bon. Like Le Bon, Freud believes that by being part of a mass movement, the individual acquires a sense of infinite power, allowing him or her to act on impulses that he or she would otherwise have to curb as an isolated individual, feeling safety in numbers. This is accompanied by a loss of conscious personality and a tendency of the individual to be infected by any emotion within the group. Emotions are amplified through a process described by Freud as mutual induction. There is significant overlap between Freud's conjectures and modern empirical research. In summary, there is significant data to support the cult of personality hypothesis. Now, let's consider hypothesis number 4. People who believe the stolen election fallacy are experiencing a mental illness. We could explore the symptoms of delusional disorder as opposed to those of paranoid personality. Consistent with our discussion of unresolved grief, we could also consider a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, the newest disorder to be added to the DSM. Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul. It was written by Brandy X. Lee. What she had to say was considered so important that the Scientific American published a summary of her book on January 11th, 2021, just 5 days after the insurrection at the Capitol. In this book, the author says that what attracts people to Trump is 2 major emotional drives: narcissistic symbiosis and shared psychosis. The problem I see with all this is that medicalizing Donald Trump's mental health as well as that of his followers is basically 100% opinion. Seemingly expert opinion, but opinion. But that doesn't make it science. There is no clearly articulated hypothesis and no testing of that hypothesis against systematically gathered data. There's no discussion of other possible interpretations of the data. I therefore do not give it much credibility, and I do not see that this way of trying to understand the followers of charismatic leaders offers us much. In addition to the methodological weaknesses I just described, this pathology-oriented approach is based on the underlying premise that those people are sick and the rest of us are healthy. There is us and there is them. It's a repeat of the culture wars fought using the armaments developed by medical science. How is this remotely helpful? Maybe some of us temporarily feel better about ourselves because the problem is supposedly them, not us, but that's about it. So now let's consider hypothesis number 5. People who believe the stolen election fallacy want a strongman leader, and they want autocratic rule. Autocracies are on the rise all across the globe. Donald Trump is really just one of a long list of aspiring autocrats. They all play from a similar playbook, which is described in detail by Donna Revere Anderson in her article titled The Psychology of the Strongman. It was published in March of 2022. In the article, she says, strongman leaders promise to deliver law, order, and prosperity, but legitimize the breaking of both domestic and international laws and norms to meet their personal aims. They're drawn to power, skilled at getting it, and then destructive at wielding it. They are good at manipulating people because they possess superficial charm and charisma, which enables them to get people to flock to them in the short term. She further states, strong men exaggerate these people's threats to spark fear in them that triggers both anger and acquiescence to strongman policies. This makes this segment of society a mobilizing force to gain support from others in bringing strong men to power. Support for strong men can cross educational, income, class, and religious lines. It has occurred historically on the political right and on the left. Researchers have reached the conclusion that people turn to strongman leaders when they feel threatened, as strongman leaders promise to take action to protect them from outsiders and to prevent frightening social, political, and economic changes. The author cites studies which have demonstrated that most people don't support extreme policies out of a desire for authoritarianism, but as a response to threats, such as terrorism or eroding social norms. Faced with these threats, even non-authoritarians will move in the direction of supporting strong men who promise to eliminate the dangers. When multiple threats appear simultaneously, this tendency can quickly intensify. As we have discussed, this was precisely the set of circumstances leading up to Donald Trump's run for the White House in 2016.
Whoa, that is some group of people, thousands. So nice, thank you very much. That's really nice, thank you. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting. And it only makes common sense. It only makes common sense. They're sending us not the right people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East.
Safety was very much on everyone's minds. In 2015, attacks by Islamic terrorists killed 129 people and wounded more than 400 people in and around Paris. There were additional major attacks in Chad, Kuwait, Pakistan, and Tunisia. In June of 2016, 50 people were killed and 53 injured during an attack at a nightclub in Orlando. 5 police officers were targeted and killed in Dallas, and 3 in Baton Rouge. In September of 2016, 29 people were injured when bombs were detonated on the streets of Manhattan. Despite wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to defeat terrorism and make us safer, ordinary Americans did not feel safer, just the opposite. And the enemy was perceived to be outsiders, people with darker skin. The central question I posed was this: how is it possible that millions of people came to believe the big lie, that the 2020 presidential election was stolen? Does it feel like we've adequately answered this question? Does it feel like something is missing? It does to me. As thoroughly as I have researched this question, it does feel like something is missing. The reason we often fail to get helpful answers to our questions is that we are asking the wrong questions. In our case, in asking the question, how is it possible that millions of people came to believe the big lie, that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, there is an implied assumption. The assumption is that people answering yes to the political pollsters literally believe the election was stolen. The pollsters get this and other questions answered, but their answers, their data, are constrained by how they pose their questions and the limited number of possible choices respondents are given to answer them. What you learn from such polling is not only limited, It may be wrong. On the other hand, what do you learn when you simply have a conversation about a topic, unconstrained by a rigid set of questions and check-the-box answers, and you just listen? That is precisely what journalist Sarah Longwell did in early 2020. She sat down with groups of MAGA supporters and asked them what they thought about the 2020 presidential election. She described what she learned from these conversations in the April 2022 Atlantic Monthly article, which she titled, "Stop the Steal Isn't Conceding." The conclusion she came to from this process was this: the supposed belief in a stolen election is really more of an attitude than an actual belief. It's a badge of membership in a community rather than a perceived pattern. How did Ms. Longwell come to this conclusion? What she observed is that in focus group after focus group, Trump supporters reported knowing something nefarious had occurred in the election process, but they couldn't easily explain how or why this occurred. What's more, they were mystified and sometimes angry that other people didn't feel the same way they did. The more that family members, friends, and the media raised questions that challenged the plausibility of their reading, the more mistrustful they became of the official results. Ms. Longwell traces these feelings back to 2016, when Donald Trump first began saying,
"The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged."
He reinforced the idea by regularly saying at his rallies that crowd size equates to a huge level of support among voters in general. So therefore, large crowds proves that he will win. Ms. Longwell quotes a Trump supporter who said to her, "I personally went to Trump rallies that were filling stadiums. Biden can't even fill a freaking library. Like, no, he didn't win. It's not true. I don't believe it. I don't buy it." We can hear in these remarks a reference to direct personal experience taking precedent over abstract reports of vote counts. With a transformative identity as winners, one can't be part of MAGA without embracing the idea, the feeling, though not necessarily the fact, that the 2020 election was actually won by their leader, Donald Trump. To say the election was stolen is the prayer that one says at the beginning of each church service, the Church of Donald Trump. It is the oath of allegiance, the ticket of admission to that church. Admission of defeat is blasphemy, the words of Judas, grounds for expulsion. Let's look at some additional double takes of the stolen election fallacy based on discussions with Trump core supporters. Daniel Dale in the journal Truth and Politics reported the results of interviews he conducted with MAGA supporters following Trump's false claims that President Obama had wiretapped his phones. These conversations revealed that Trump supporters' views of this lie varied. They said that Trump was either correct, possibly correct, mistaken but well-intentioned, or a delightfully cunning manipulator, fomenting chaos to strengthen his political hand, sticking it to the libs. What most objective observers would call lies were to Trump supporters strategic statements designed specifically to upset the apple cart. They were brilliant. So, when a liar knows he or she is lying, and the listeners know they are hearing lies but appreciate them as a tactic of political warfare, is it accurate to call them lies? I don't think so, and neither does psychologist Kang Lee from the University of Toronto, who describes these as blue lies, which fall in between generous white lies and selfish black lies. In an article published in Greater Good magazine, he says, a blue lie against another group is simultaneously selfless and self-serving. For example, you can lie about your baseball team's having cheated in a game, which is antisocial, but it's for the purpose of helping your team. From this perspective, lying is a strategy, not a bug of Trump's campaign and presidency. It serves to bind his supporters together, strengthening his political base, even as it infuriates and confuses most everyone else. In a 2008 study of 7, 9, and 11-year-old children, the first of its kind, Kang Lee and colleagues found that children become more likely to endorse and tell blue lies as they grow older. For example, given an opportunity to lie to an interviewer about rule breaking in the selection process of a school chess team, many were willing to do so, older kids more than young ones. The children telling these lies didn't stand to selfishly benefit, they were doing it on behalf of their school. This line of research suggests that while black lies drives people apart and white lies draw them together, blue lies do both. They help bring some people together by deceiving those in another group. So, when at the end of his presidency, a Washington Post fact-checker adds up all of President Trump's false claims and concludes that the president made 30,573 false or misleading claims, we really don't know how many of these false claims were literally believed to be true by Trump's core followers and how many were known to be untrue, but did not affect his supporters' view of him. And among this latter group, we don't know how many supporters were thinking, "Way to go, man. I know what you're doing. Stick it to those libs." In other words, this subgroup of Trump supporters viewed each supposed lie as a tactical jab at their collective enemy, a brilliant maneuver that poked a finger in the eye of those stupid libs who fell for the jab each time, exploding in a diluted rage of righteous indignation. The libs moronically failing to get the inside joke. Of course, there were other core Trump supporters who also did not get the memo. They believed the lie, and many others. Literally. Let's take a moment to remind ourselves that at times, none of us get the memo. We all have views that are products of our unique historical and cultural times. We all use cognitive dissonance reducing strategies most of the time to keep our worldviews and self-images intact. It isn't just Trump true believers, or Netanyahu, or Putin true believers, or the followers of any number of cult-like autocratic leaders from around the world. We all share the same DNA, and all of us, at one time or another, are believers. And believers embrace non-objective realities. That's just how we are wired. If we are to find successful ways to mitigate the destructive aspects of belief, we need to base our efforts on what we know to be true about human beings, not what we wish were true. For example, creating non-gerrymandered competitive congressional districts creates incentives for politicians to speak and appeal to the middle of the electorate rather than to the extreme wings of their parties. This changes the tone and substance of our elections. This is not wishful thinking. It has been done. As Daniel Pink challenges us in his Washington Post columns, why not? Let's spend less time opining about who's right and who's wrong, and more time imagining what's possible.